We talked a little bit about the approach with the drawing part of a watercolor painting. So we want to have those kind of basic proportions. We started with that egg shape, divided it in half, and then divided it in half two more times after that to get the placement of those features. And then I do want to make sure that I have erased all of those kind of dividing lines so that I don't make them permanent in the painting. And then anything else that I don't want to be visible in the final painting, that's not going to be kind of covered with something a little bit darker, I would also want to erase those as well. But I think most of this kind of stuff is something that is, they'll be kind of hidden by shadows and hidden by kind of darker colors and stuff around the features. When I think about the photo, one thing I want to look at is what are the lightest parts of the face. There are really kind of no super white highlights in the photograph. There are some that get kind of close. But one thing that really helps me is if I take just a plain piece of paper and I cut a little tiny hole in it. And I put that white piece of paper over those places that to me look really light. And if I'm just trying to figure out what color that is, sometimes it helps me to have that little window and then compare it to the white of the paper around it, right? So if I feel like, okay, this may be the brightest place in the portrait, or in the photograph. Maybe it's the highlight on the nose, the highlight on the forehead. How light is that, right? So I'm going to take that white piece of paper and put that over that brightest of highlight. And in fact, there's quite a bit of kind of pinkish flesh tone color there, right? So it's not really white at all. I'm going to come up here to the forehead and put that little window over the brightest parts of the forehead. There's quite a bit of color in that as well. So your photo might be very different from this. It might, in fact, have a lot of bright white highlights. So if that's the case, you definitely want to work around those, right, with your first washes. But what I'm gonna do is to go ahead and use a little bit of a wet into wet technique for my first step. And it's not super complicated. All I'm gonna do is simply wet the face and then put my first wash of color on the portrait while that original wash is still wet. So I'm going to use my big brush, and I'm simply going to go over the whole face with some water. All right, so I'm kind of wetting the surface of the portrait. You may notice a little bit of the gray graphite kind of moving around a little bit. Hopefully that's not going to gray out your portrait too much. So I'm kind of not having to be super careful here because nothing in this portrait is very, very white. Right, so I'm wetting it and I'm going to go all the way through the neck. And all the way through the ears as well. And I really could extend that all the way up through the hairline. I'm going to tilt the paper a little bit to make sure that I haven't missed anything. And I've gone up through the hairline because I don't want the hair to look like it's something that's a separate piece pasted on, right? Hair is growing out of skin, right? So we want to continue that skin color up there as well. So I need to work fast here. So I'm going to keep going, and what I'm going to do is mix yellow ochre, a little bit of cadmium red, so yellow ochre and cadmium red gives me kind of a bright orangey tone, right? Now, one thing I'm also going to do is to touch just a tiny bit of burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is a good kind of brown, fleshy, skin color, but it can dull it out just a little bit, so I want to not put as much of that in the mix. So cadmium red, yellow ochre. Then I'm gonna go in to the sections of I'm gonna start up here with my forehead. I'm just with my big brush. I'm gonna lay in everything that is not the brightest of those highlights. And if my paper is still wet, it's going to kind of softly bleed and not create any hard edges, right? So, and as I work, if I notice that it's starting to create those hard edges, I'm just going to go through that section and just soften it a little bit. Did I hear a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, would you say this color is like your mid-tone?
This would be, I think, kind of my first layer. I might feel like the midtones would come after this.
Okay.
Kind of my first layer of color. And even though I'm going to want a lot of this to be much, much darker and deeper, I'm going to go ahead and put this layer everywhere, you know, except for the places that are really super light. This is another spot here in the forehead that kind of gets fairly light, but I'm going to lift some of that, just kind of scooping that color a little bit before that hardened into an outline. And I moved around the highlight on the nose, the highlight on the right side of the cheek, but then everywhere else I've got at least a layer of this kind of warm skin tone. And the right side of the face does have that highlight on the cheek, but then picks up again as I move to the right side over here. It gets some on the ear. And one thing, while the painting is still a little bit wet, while that first layer is wet, is I can still do a little bit of lifting. So I've got that highlight on the nose, and maybe I'll kind of pull some of that color out just a little bit. There's the highlight on the cheekbone over here on the right, so I'm gonna, with my big brush, kind of pull a little bit of that out. The highlight on the forehead is still fairly light, so I think I might be okay there. But wetting my brush and then blotting it, and then kind of, just kind of scooping out just a little bit more of those colors while they're still wet is gonna help me keep some of those lighter sections in place. I don't want to rough the paper up too much, right? I don't want to do tons of this kind of brushing off of the paper, but little bit of water in my brush and then kind of moving along those sections that are a little bit lighter. Will help lift those a little bit. And the lips are skin tone as well, right? I'm going to be darkening those. I'm going to make those redder, but put that skin tone in there because you don't want the lips to look separate, right? So even though a lot of us have a bunch more of those kind of reddish tones in our lips, it doesn't hurt to have some of the red with the yellow ochre in there as well. Because I want to be able to overlap the hair color, which is going to be much darker, on top of the skin tone, I'm going to go ahead and kind of expand that first color right up into the hair. And there are a few places of highlights, so maybe a couple of gray hairs in there, so I might want to keep those fairly light. But everything else, I'm going to kind of keep the idea of skin moving up into the hairline, and then I can always pull down those darker shapes back on top of it, right? So if I feel like my first kind of pass with that kind of warm tone, I'm happy with the placement of it, and it hasn't covered places that are lighter or things that I wanted to keep light, then I can certainly let that dry, right? So I think one of the things that helps here is that at least now I have some color on there. I'm no longer dealing with the scary white of the paper, and I have a little bit of the the feeling of the three-dimensional structure of the face. While that paint is still wet, you can do just a little more lifting if you need to, right? So if I felt like I needed to kind of pull this light up in the forehead just a little bit further, for example, I could do that. And you can always use a piece of paper towel. I've got an extra one here. That where if you've lifted something up or tried to lift something up, but it's not doing that with your brush, you could blot it a little bit with your paper towel and sometimes lift a little bit of that color. But I don't really, I don't want to scrub it too much, and I'm not really, I'm not after a whole lot in this first pass, right? This is just kind of my beginning hint of color. Then the second step, this is probably fairly close to being dry already, right? So if I put it up to my lamp here, which is pretty hot, it would be fairly dry. My second layer, I can let this dry completely. I can be like, phew, I've done that first layer. I don't have to worry about, having everything perfect. Take it in those, really short kind of baby steps. My next layer, what I think I'll do is switch to this slightly smaller brush, and it's a round brush. So while that first one was a big square brush, the further I get in a painting, the more kind of accurate I want my brushes to be. But I don't want to use something this small at this point, right? So if I switch to something this small and I'm trying to paint the whole face before it dries, then that's just going to make it harder on myself. So I want to keep it as big as possible, but I'm switching to the round so that I can kind of get some of those points where I need to, right? I can thin it out where I need to. And then I'm going to take those same colors, but this time I'm going to pull just a little more of that burnt sienna into the wash. So yellow ochre, cadmium red, a little bit of burnt sienna. And then I'm going to say, okay, well, the more I look at this, the more I'm going to want to darken this section in the forehead. This section over here is super dark, so I'm going to keep layering everything that is darker than these white highlights, right? So I'm going to darken everything in those stages. So if I start again with the forehead here at the top, one thing I noticed about the colors up here at the top of the forehead is that there really seems to be almost, a pronounced kind of red component. So I'm going to put just a little more of that cadmium red in that section. And if I want to just take that one section of the forehead before I move on there, and take my brush, I've washed it out a little bit, but I'm going to soften the edges of those areas that I just painted. Blotting my brush again. I'm kind of keeping those highlights in place. I don't want to just kind of paint over what I just painted with my first pass. But I'm going to run along the places where I just deepened the color a little bit and just kind of blend them, softening those edges. So that if I were to do something that looks kind of like what's happening in terms of the lights and the darks here in the forehead, I'm not going to worry about the, the wrinkles in the forehead yet. It's something I can do later. And then I can keep going. I've got a little deeper color where the eyebrows meet the nose. There's definitely deeper color below the eyebrows and above the eyelids. The section on the forehead kind of darkens, obviously, with the eyebrow over on the left side where it's mostly in shadow. And places where I want to leave nice and light, like this upper lid here, you can lift that just a wee bit. And then go along those edges that I just kind of, quickly painted in, but be a little more kind of blended. Going along those edges to help transition them to the areas around it. And we go back and pick up a little more of that same color, right? And as you're working on this kind of second or even third layer, you can start to be a little more specific. So for example, where you see a skin tone kind of changing into something that looks more pink, I'll definitely add that in. It looks a little more kind of orangish, whatever those changes happen to be. And then the side of the nose is definitely going to be much darker, but I'm going to go ahead and put that first layer in here, kind of moving around that highlight that goes along the top of the nose. And then again, I'm going to blot my brush and kind of run my brush along the edge of those forms that I just painted. And something that's going to help the shape of your nose is when you get those darks in there. Of course, you don't have to worry about things like the dark shape of the nostril until almost the last phases of the painting, right? You got those drawn in there, so you don't really have to worry about those yet. And something I noticed about the left side of the face over here in the photo is that it does seem like there's kind of this, reddish, kind of pinkish tone that happens here and over on the right as well. So I'm going to add just a little more of that in the mix, right? A little more of that cadmium red. So everything over here on the left side of the face that is pretty much in shadow could use another layer, right, of all of this color that I'm painting on here. And then the lights and the darks start to shift a little bit, maybe right about there underneath the nose. And as I'm working on these kind of, slightly deeper layers, I can always go back as I'm doing them. If I see something kind of drawing awkwardly or whatever, don't hesitate to go back with your brush kind of midstream. But I could definitely use a little more color, especially in places like this section here over on the right side of the face, where looks like right about here starts to deepen. And again, with the mouth, I want to kind of break down just the lights and the darks of the mouth. Don't want to really worry about too much of those details yet. Scooping around the edges to soften those a little bit, to kind of create that effect of the cheeks and the smile. And this is one place where I feel like, okay, I actually wanted to keep that kind of light. So let's wash the brush out a little bit and take some water. Not a lot, but just a little bit of water on my brush and kind of sweep that off to lighten that just slightly. So something like this would be kind of my second pass over the face, right? So the color is deepening a little bit, but it's still staying quite warm. So I basically got red, yellow ochre, and a little bit of burnt sienna. Now, eventually what I am going to be looking at, the deeper the color gets, is that I can only get kind of so deep in terms of the shadowed section. So over here on the left, I'm going to have my warm colors, but I also want to be able to add a little bit of a cool color to create that effect of shadow, right? This is the warm side of, actually it's a very warm photograph overall, right? So your photograph may have much more of those kind of cool tones present. But one thing I do notice is that, especially over here on the left side of the forehead, the left side of the face over here, is that it does start to look a little more like it could approach close to a black, right? So one thing I can do with those three colors, with my cadmium red, my burnt sienna, my yellow ochre, is that I can add the component of something cool. So if I add a bit of ultramarine blue, I've got this warm color mixed. If I take a little bit of that ultramarine blue and I add it to that combination, what I'm going to get is a nice kind of deep version of that skin color, but now I've neutralized a little bit, I've cooled it, and I've darkened it. So I can take this color and start to put in things like, for example, let's look at the left side of the cheek. And it gets pretty dark over here on the left. And then very dark underneath the chin. So if I'm using something like that, I can take my original kind of warm color and move it up against that I just painted, and kind of let that transition a little bit, let that soften. And then I'm also going to kind of pull some of that into the rest of the face. And even after I add something like that, those deeper skin tones and the ones that are in shadow, I can always go back on top of them, right? Because my paint is still transparent, right? We're working with a transparent painting media. I can go back on top of them and make them warmer if I need, for example, some more red. I want that to be a little more kind of a warm skin tone. I can certainly put a layer of kind of transparent red on top of that if I felt like my original mix was not exactly, if I feel like it's getting too grayish or too coolish. And sometimes that can happen when you start to add things like blue, right, to skin tone. It can feel like, oh my gosh, I turned it all gray and it looks weird. If you add a transparent layer, wash of red on top of it, it's almost like a miracle. You've brought it back to life, right? If I were to keep going with the details of the face, let's say that I've done all of the darker parts of the face. Okay, we're going to kind of fast forward a little bit. What I'm going to do for the last kind of stages of description in the face is to switch to my smaller brush. And I'm going to take now just my burnt sienna. And I'm going to mix a little bit of my ultramarine blue with it. I'm going to make a really nice dark tone here. And the things that I want to look for in the features of the face, of course, I think I would still have some darker places over here on the right to put in because this is a pretty deep color, right? So I think I would kind of darken that a little bit. But let's jump back over. I think this might be dry enough. Jump back over here to the left side and start to articulate a little bit of these kind of linear things, right? Which are things like the line above the eye. I can still see my pencil marks in there, so I'm gonna put the shape of the eye, the line of the lid of the upper eye. I'm gonna draw a little circle there for the highlight that I see in the eye, so I'm not gonna paint it totally solid.
All right, is that black or is that a dark brown?
This is a dark brown that I mixed with burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. So I put in something like this for the shape of the eye. What I'm going to do is while I still have that mixed up, I'm going to actually put a little bit of that original skin color that I mixed up with what I just painted the shape of the eye with. And I'm going to articulate a little bit of the line of the upper lid. And while I'm in this section of the face, I'm gonna, with some of that same color, start to kind of put in some of the dark of the eyebrows. The thing about painting the eyebrows is that we don't necessarily want them to look like individual hairs necessarily in our painting. So what I'm really looking at is the mass of the color, right? Don't want them all to look exactly the same. But I can start to kind of lay in the dark shape of the brow. Just going to help establish the position of it in the face. And something I notice about the lid of the brow is that it gets darker over here on the left. And then it also darkened over here on the corner of the eye. And then connects with a shadow, almost like it's an extension of the brow, right? And then lightens a little bit as I move down the length of the nose. And because I've got a lot of darks around the eye itself, one thing that I need to continue with is to add some of these darker tones around the eye, the lines underneath it, and then towards the edge of it, to kind of help that eye look like it belongs to the rest of the face, right? It's got to connect. And then something else I want to do is that when I look at the photograph, something I notice is that there's not really any super bright whites in the eyes. The photograph, again, if I look at the whites of the eyes, put my little piece of white paper on top of the whites of the eyes, there's the white of the eye, right? It's not really white, right? There's a lot of color in that. If I were to leave the whites of the eyes in my painting really white, it wouldn't look very natural. So I want to set the eye back into the face a little bit. And so to do that, I'm gonna, obviously I would let the eye dry, right? The dark part of it that I painted. But I'm gonna take just a little bit of the skin tone that I actually used on the rest of the face. And I'm just gonna knock the white of the eye back into the head a little bit. I'm going to cut down the white of the eye. And then I'm going to take a little bit of just the red, because we have that little bit of kind of pinkish red that happens in the corner of our eyes. And if I were to keep working on this section of the face, one thing I may have is many more of these kind of darker kind of lines, right? They would have something to do with the way that I use my brush in a much kind of darker way, but use those kind of thin lines to articulate that. And then the one over here on the right, it's not going to be quite as dark as the one on the left in many places, but around the eye and the eyelid and the line above the eye, you see those are pretty equal in the photograph, right? So if I kept working, there's going to be a lot more stages of those kind of dark areas. And then the thing about the lips, if I come down to the lips, my red, my cadmium red, the version that I have is really super kind of orangey. And you guys might want to mix a little bit if you're doing something that kind of tilts more towards a more violet kind of red, is to use a little bit of your crimson, right? So I'm going to take a little bit of that crimson red and make a red that's a little bit closer to this kind of, less of an orangey red in the mouth. And then one thing I notice about the bottom lip is that it's got this really kind of bright highlight on the bottom lip. And then it darkens again along the bottom section of that lower lip. I'm leaving that little bit of highlight in place. And then the upper lip is going to be much darker. But I'm going to go ahead and put this kind of brighter color on there to begin with. And then once it dries, I'm going to be able to kind of put that darker layer on top of that red. And then this is something that as I work around the shape of the mouth, I've got much more of these kind of red, kind of orangish tones that extend out through the cheek, right? Almost looks like she has blush on. So put some more of those kind of warmer tones and kind of pull some of that out in the other sections of the face. So I don't want that to look like a separate color, right? Her lips are part of her face. And so I'm going to take that red use a little more of my crimson. And then I'm gonna, just because I have it already mixed, I've got that really dark brown that I mixed, the burnt sienna with that blue. I'm gonna take that same color, I'm gonna put some of that in that upper lip, right, to separate the upper lip from the bottom lip. I'm not gonna do the whole mouth, just to kind of show you what I'm talking about. And then her smile kind of moves off to the right, has this little kind of dimple here. And then there's a little bit of another kind of increased value for the line of the face. Moves around that shape a little bit. So I would continue to keep darkening things around the mouth just to kind of give it that context. I don't want it to look too separate from what's happening in the rest of the face. I want it to feel like it, it's not a value that kind of sticks out too much.